The 20th century was kind of a crazy time. Two world wars, numerous smaller scale wars, new weaponry that can actually annihilate the world, the end of imperialism, and by the end, the triumph of capitalism and the discrediting of communism. In this era of conflict and change, numerous movements emerged to challenge that status quo. The first movement I'm going to talk about is nonviolent protest in itself. This movement is really pioneered by Gandhi. Gandhi comes of age as a lawyer in South Africa, where he is really struck by the segregation he sees between the black and white populations there. During World War I, he moved back to India and started to form his theory of satyagraha, or nonviolent resistance. Satyagraha translates to truth force, and I think that translation really captures how Gandhi sees this force working. It's very, the truth will set you free to me. In this case, the people who will be set free are the Indians. Gandhi defines them as the, quote, heroic meek, and actively they are nonviolent. So it wasn't just hope. It was civil disobedience. It was peacefully pursuing the freedom of the Indian people. This movement has far-reaching effects. Various civil rights movements, including the one led by Martin Luther King Jr. for African Americans, employ the same nonviolent methods. Other decolonization movements will also pursue negotiation instead of violence. Violence to achieve political aims, however, does happen in the 20th and 21st centuries. The first major event of the 20th century, World War I, begins with an act of terrorism, and terrorism will continue throughout the century. From terrorist attacks to try and push decolonization or other forms of unwelcome political control, Puerto Rican nationalists, the Irish Republican Army, and Basque separatists come to mind, to terrorist attacks driven by religious fundamentalism. It's about to become one of the dominant themes of the time period. First, let's talk about resistance to established power structures through separatist movements that are often violent. We've spoken before about the Irish nationalist movement, starting with the reemergence of Gaelic and other protests against the force of British cultural and political dominance. A lot of this nationalist sentiment starts to come to a head, like a lot of other things, during World War I. World War I set the drive for Irish independence back, and many Irishmen fought for the British in the trenches of Belgium and France. The war obviously exacerbated issues in Ireland and provided the opportunity for separatists, led by the Irish Republican Brotherhood, to launch an overthrow of the British government in Dublin. On Easter 1916, they did just that. This comes to be known as the Easter Rising. They declare and establish an Irish Republic. At first, it seems like the British don't have the energy to put down the Rising, since most of their energy is actually on the continent fighting World War I. But over the course of just a week, British troops put down the Rising and execute the leaders. Following the execution of the leaders, sympathy for independence grew, and that was reflected in how well Sinn Féin, the political party, which means ourselves alone, did in pseudo-parliamentary elections in the following years. I say pseudo-parliamentary because the Sinn Féin members were part of the underground Irish parliament, not the official representatives who went to London. It also solidified the idea that armed struggle was the only way to secure independence and an Irish republic. The guerrilla campaigns of armed struggle are led by the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. What's called the Irish War of Independence occurs after World War I, from 1919 to 1921, and ends with the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which grants independence to what is today the Republic of Ireland, but then it was called the Irish Free State. This means that the island is not unified, and that parts of it still remain in the United Kingdom, notably Northern Ireland. Parts of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, support the treaty and parts don't. The anti-treaty IRA continued to conduct guerrilla warfare throughout the ensuing decades until, under increasing pressure from leftist Marxist members in the 1960s, it split in 1969. The period from 1969 to 1998 is called the Troubles, where the main issue is the unification of Northern Ireland with the rest of Ireland to create a whole Republic of Ireland. Most of the violence committed during the Troubles consisted of Republican paramilitary troops versus Loyalist paramilitary troops, but unfortunately, most of the victims were civilians. Bombings organized by the IRA throughout Belfast, the capital of Northern Ireland, and sometimes elsewhere, were most common. But the early 1970s saw some of the worst violence, mostly conducted by British troops. Bloody Sunday, for example, like from the U2 song, happened when British troops shot and killed 13 unarmed men at a rally. The violence didn't really subside throughout the 1970s, 80s, or 90s until the Good Friday Agreement of 1998. which devolved the government from Northern Ireland from London and allowed Unionists and Republicans to share power. The future of Northern Ireland, either staying in the UK or joining the Republic of Ireland, was postponed until a later referendum of the people could be held, and that's where we still exist today. Now, let's talk about Puerto Rico. Nationalist and anti-colonial feeling had been strong in Puerto Rico against the Spanish prior to the Spanish-American War, and it remained so after the island transferred to a U.S. possession. The Puerto Rican Nationalist Party was founded in 1922 with the goal of independence for Puerto Rico. One of its primary leaders was a man named Pedro Albizu Campos, a man of mixed Spanish and African heritage, who grew up in poverty but graduated from Harvard with a dual chemistry and literature degree. He fought for the U.S. in World War I in a segregated unit and returned from the war deeply suspicious of the United States. Not suspicious enough to not attend Harvard Law, which he did, and then returned to Puerto Rico to become the vice president of the Nationalist Party. Here he is seen speaking here. As vice president of the party, he traveled around Latin America to stir up support for Puerto Rican independence and greater pan-Latin American feelings. As party president after 1930, he attempted to use the colonial government of Puerto Rico to advocate for independence, but really didn't think that it was getting anywhere. So, after 1932, Albizu Campos and the party began to advocate for violent revolution, including the 1936 assassination of police chief Elisha Riggs. After this political assassination, the entire party leadership was arrested, and they're charged with sedition and imprisoned in Atlanta. After his release from prison in 1947, he returned to Puerto Rico, even more committed to a violent struggle for independence, leading island-wide bombings and an assassination attempt on President Truman. After being released from prison for that, he was promptly returned to prison after publicly praising a gun attack on the U.S. Capitol building, particularly the House of Representatives, by Puerto Rican nationalists. His health deteriorated while he was in prison, and he claimed that he had been purposely poisoned by radiation while he was there. Note, the Department of Energy confirmed in 1994 that it did do radiation experiments on prisoners during this time frame. He died of a stroke in 1965 after being pardoned by the governor of Puerto Rico in 1964. As you can tell from his life story, the independence movement in Puerto Rico was pretty eventful throughout the first half of the 20th century, and it definitely undercut some of the declarations that the United States was making against the Soviet Union. In the second half of the 20th century, a different kind of separatist or nationalist movement emerged, particularly in the Middle East. This movement emerged from a variety of countries in the war-torn and post-colonial area, particularly after 1979. One of the most prominent is Al-Qaeda. We have to back up a little to talk about them. So during the Soviet-Afghan War of 1979 to 1989, we see a large number of Islamists migrate to Afghanistan to help support the Mujahideen in their struggle against the Soviets. For many Islamists, the war is seen as a jihad, or a righteous struggle, against the godless communists. This is where Osama bin Laden comes in, bringing with him Saudi construction and oil money, and a network of big money connections to fund the anti-Soviet guerrilla war. Following the conclusion of the war in Afghanistan, bin Laden wanted to take his movement global, using guerrilla tactics to undermine anywhere an Islamist government was under threat. In the 1990s, many of these governments were being policed by the United States, which became enemy number one due to its support of colonial regimes from before World War II, its alliance with Israel and refusal to support the sovereignty of Palestinians, and its involvement in Cold War politics in the region, like the overthrow of the Iranian government in 1953 and support of other, quote, infidel governments like the Saudi government. For Al-Qaeda, this was another form of imperialism that could not be tolerated. In a 1997 CNN interview, bin Laden said, quote, "The U.S. today, as a result of the arrogant atmosphere, has set a double standard, calling whoever goes against its injustice a terrorist. It wants to occupy our countries, steal our resources, impose on us agents to rule us, and then wants us to agree to all this." The ideology espoused by bin Laden and Al-Qaeda culminated in several attacks on U.S. military forces, including the bombing of the USS Cole off the coast of Yemen, and on civilians with the attack on the World Trade Center in 2001. The goal of these terrorist attacks was eventually to force the U.S., particularly and the West at large, to withdraw its military and economic installations from the Middle East. Violence to achieve political aims is generally defined as terrorism. And one more example of this will be communist guerrillas. If this topic is named global resistance to established power structures, we have to talk about the most mythologized and romanticized communist guerrilla out there, Che Guevara. Ernesto Che Guevara is born to a pretty well-off Argentinian family, and after a battle with asthma growing up, he went off to Buenos Aires to study medicine, but soon became disillusioned and went on a motorcycle journey of discovery through the Andes, where, like the Buddha, his aristocratic worldview would be shattered by the poverty he saw. This is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the romanticism and mythology that has grown up around him over the years. After abandoning medicine on his subsequent journey, Che ended up in Guatemala just in time to witness the CIA overthrow of Arbenz and his reformist policies. He had already become critical of Western motives in Latin America and of the implications of capitalist systems, but witnessing this event pushed him over the edge, and he became a full-fledged revolutionary, committed to Marxist and anti-American ideas and practices. In Mexico in 1955, he met with another young revolutionary, Fidel Castro, and he immediately became entrenched in the plans for the Cuban Revolution and in the fighting against Fulgencio Batista. He distinguished himself as a jungle fighter. In Castro's new revolutionary regime, he oversaw the imprisonment and execution of, quote, anti-revolutionaries, and later oversaw the Cuban Central Bank and Ministry of Industries. Please note, Che did not have education or training in either of these areas, but he did have revolutionary passion. By 1965, he had renounced his Cuban citizenship and had committed himself to traveling around the world, assisting other revolutionaries in their quest to expand international socialism. Eyewitness accounts saw him everywhere, from Vietnam to Dar es Salaam, but we know for sure he was fighting in the jungles of the Congo, eventually ineffectively. From there, he returned to Argentina, but that didn't work either. And finally, he snuck into Bolivia, hoping to ignite a continental-wide revolution. But by this time, the CIA was on to him, and without any more support from Castro or Khrushchev, he was captured and executed in 1967 in the Bolivian Andes. This last image of him, prone and Christ-like, is a fitting bookend to the commercialized Che, looking forward toward a future of revolution. What does Che's legacy show us? Does it show us that those who seek change are always destined to fail? Does it show us that violence only begets more violence? Do the thousands of people who turned out on the 50th anniversary of his execution in 2017, waving his picture, show us that hope for change endures? Is it even a change that we want? Che was responsible for the execution of 500 not really guilty people. What a fitting end to an episode that began with me talking about Gandhian nonviolence. It seems that the truth force of Satyagraha, the patience of MLK, have been the most effective means of challenging established power structures. While the image of the violent revolutionary in jungle fatigues and toting a machine gun may be more exciting, change comes slowly, and some changes may not be worth fighting for. That's all for today. Thanks for watching. Remember to like and subscribe to always stay up to date in APU World History.